Ukraine is continuing to unrelentingly piecemeal off pieces of Russian territory day by day. But do they have most of their combat power still in reserve? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It's July 19th, 2023. This is your daily Ukraine update. Let's get into it. Okay, first, let's take a look at the control map. And the biggest changes that we have is, of course, outside Klitschivka and Kurdyumivka, where we're seeing some level of advance of Ukrainian forces. Most critically, it looks like they're passing into Klitschivka itself. You can see Ukrainian-controlled territory and contested territory, actually including a number of roads that mark the outskirts of the town. So the liberation of Klitschivka probably underway here. Again, you can see significant reversals in the aggregate, especially around this Klitschivka area. When we look at, let's actually try to get the ruler out here. There we go. So we could see this would actually mark from the furthest advance of Russian forces all the way towards the furthest inroads they've made is a total of 6 kilometers. So certainly not a trivial amount given the pace of this offensive. When we look at some of the other changes on the battlefield, they're relatively minor, small adjustments, tiny amount of territory, right, being reported, a single windbreak here near Berkiva, a small sliver of Russian territory carved off outside of Orokivo, Vasilivka, as well as a few minor, again, adjustments, all of which are favoring Ukraine, which I think is worth noting, but they're not necessarily reflective of major substantive progress, right? Progress in Novopokova, as well as some territory being marked as fully liberated by Ukraine outside of Novodanilivka. Now, when we look over at the combat map, this is where things get interesting, right? 4 hours ago, Ukrainian Ministry of Defense forces reporting success outside of or within Staromayorsk, which is interesting to me for a couple of reasons. Most significantly, it's what we talked about, right? You can see Ukrainian forces pressuring Russian forces near Priutine, as well as Oruzane. And you can even see that it appears they're designating Russian forces as starting their withdrawal even on the western bank of the, looks like the Pika River, which is, again, significant because this is probably one of the Russian defenders' most reliable barriers here in Staromayorsk. So the fact that Ukrainian forces can potentially start to clear this city, or that Russian forces may feel it necessary to withdraw, as you can see, again, we're talking about from Ukrainian-controlled territory to the sole roadway allowing Russian forces in and out of Staromayorsk. You can see that this has Ukrainian forces as being probably within around a kilometer, maybe a kilometer and a half of this roadway, which is easily makes it an easy engagement area for even small arms fire, let alone mortars and artillery. So, plus, this can be placed under constant observation. So the pressure on Russian defenders is really probably increasing and is going to increase over the next probably 72 hours. I think you probably will see Russian forces realize they have to withdraw from Staromayorsk or risk annihilation. Doesn't mean Russian forces won't risk annihilation. We know their tactics and how they operate. Other than that, minimal activities across the front line, a very light day as far as Russian counterattacks goes. Some Russian counterattacks around Staromayorsk, some attacks around Donetsk and Avdiivka. One thing I did want to point out is that, first off, if you're a member of Combat Vet News, we actually took a look yesterday at the surge in Russian POWs across the front lines. And I think that's indicative of effects, right, of Ukrainian forces pressuring Russian logistics and supply, right? Because ultimately, when you're starving, when you're thirsty, when you're out of ammunition, that's when formations are going to consider surrendering. So by increasing this pressure, it seems to be paying at least some dividends. And even if we're not seeing it in terms of large tactical formations breaking apart, it's definitely reflective of a reduced Russian will to fight. And I think that's contributing to the fact that we've seen these steady gains from Ukrainian forces on both the southern and eastern fronts. Also, this week, I'm going to be taking a look at the viral video of Ukrainian-aligned Chechen forces ambushing a Russian convoy. It sounds like it's absolutely wild. And if you want the uncensored breakdown, the only place you can get it is going to be on combatvetnews.com. You should become a member. Any one of these tiers will get you access to the members-only content, as well as the exclusive room on the Discord, and the shout-outs at the end of videos if you want the lieutenant or the colonel tier. So check it out, combatvetnews.com up there. Link is also in the description. Okay, let's talk a little bit about two other pieces of news, including a lot more combat power, right? The top military officer, General Miley, has said that Ukraine's offensive isn't failing. It's too early to make that judgment, which is not necessarily a ringing endorsement. Emphasize the difficult nature of the fight, but that they are reminding that significant amounts of Ukrainian combat power has yet to be committed to the fight, right? There's a lot of combat power. As we've talked about, NATO doctrine, it bakes in the expectation that there's got to be an uncommitted reserve of considerable size in order to break through Russian lines and exploit breakthroughs. And even the military officers are acknowledging that the big challenge in the tactical effort is working their way through these Russian minefields. Right? Ukraine will decide when to use the combat power and complex training its allies have provided. He says it's far from a failure. It's way too early to make that kind of call. Right now, they're preserving their combat power, and they're slowly and deliberately working their way through all these minefields. It's a tough fight. It's a very difficult fight, is his exact quote. I found this was fascinating, that the thing that comes to mind as the challenge they're facing is minefields. Remember, we can discern some of the U.S. intelligence community's actual assessments by the statements of someone like General Miley. So the fact that he casually throws out that the biggest challenge is minefields, to me, is validating some of the things that we've seen and talked about, that modern mechanized warfare has a tough time with industrial scale mining operations. Demining is hard. It requires a lot of effort, and it's very, very easy, right? We just recently took a look at a video released by Russia where they showed how they plant mines, and it's unbelievably easy. You and I, as a viewer, literally could plant hundreds, dozens of mines in an hour. You simply have to twist them a little bit, arm them, and throw them. And we see literally in the course of maybe a 10-minute video, a Russian soldier deploy maybe half a dozen to a dozen mines, anti-personnel mines in a field. So there's an acknowledgement from Miley that there's a long way to go, but that navigating these minefields is one of the biggest challenges facing them. Meanwhile, President Biden has authorized the military to commit some of its reserve troops to augment U.S. forces in Europe, which is not itself that newsworthy. This has been a common occurrence, and to supplement key roles with reserve forces. In fact, as of a couple of years ago, when I was still in the reserves, there was an entire site on the military networks showing all the open positions for reservists that the U.S. Army was trying to fill. And you could actually apply, much like a regular job board, and say, hey, I heard you're looking for an operations officer in Europe. I'm a grad student on my summer break. Let me spend 6 weeks there doing this work. And actually, looking back, I probably should have done that. That would have been really good to both get paid and rack up some professional experience in the reserve forces. Especially doing something like, again, being an operations officer or an assistant S3 in a forward deployed European role. But what's also somewhat troubling and reflective, perhaps, of the crisis in recruiting is that they're also drawing 450 soldiers from the Individual Ready Reserve. The Individual Ready Reserve, or the IRR, is usually the a holding ground, so to speak, for veterans who have completed their military service and are expected to remain sort of on the book, so to speak, that can be called up in the event of a national emergency. But the fact that, again, Atlantic Resolve, which is the U.S. forces deterring Russian aggression outside of Ukraine and providing some level of support, is seen as being so shorthanded that I assume specialty roles are being called up from the IRR, is a troubling reflection of just how poor the military's manpower crisis is at this time. Right. And certainly if you are a potential aggressor of the United States, you see this and you say, wow, despite not being at war in Iraq and Afghanistan, the U.S. is still having to draw from its deepest category of reservists. It's reached as far down as possible into its reserve forces in order to just maintain their sort of deterrent presence in Europe. Not a great sign for the U.S. military. Of course, the last news that we already talked about from War Mapper reporting that again, the increasing pace of progress in Kurdyumivka and Klachivka, where Ukrainian forces are again piecemealing, meter by meter, Russian forces from these areas. So anyway, guys, that's all I had for you. Of course, I got to give a big shout out to all the Colonel tier members of combatvetnews.com, and thank you to our Colonel tier members. And I hope to see you over on combatvetnews.com. Cheers and thank you.